Good morning, everyone. My name is Hsiang, and I'm here chairing this session in the place of Vice President Liu of the Academia Sinica, because he has to go back to Taiwan this morning. It is my pleasure to so we have a keynote session here with two distinguished speakers. The first one is Professor Kenneth. He's the Raffles Professor of Humanities and the head of the Chinese Studies Department of the National University of Singapore. Before coming to Singapore, I think he spent quite a number of years at McGill University in Canada. He has written several books recently on Southeast Asia and Singapore since he came here, and he's most known, I think, at least to me, of his work on religious rituals in southern China and Southeast Asia, especially involving the Fujian people. He wrote a wonderful book called Rituals of Putian, which is a very complicated book, okay? But it uses three ritual alliances to describe how things work in Putian, which I found really fascinating. He actually also produced a movie on the Putian ritual. Now his current project are the construction of an interactive multimedia Singapore historical GIS and the Singapore bibliographic database. So let's welcome Professor Dean.
Thank you, Professor Jieh, very much for your kind introduction, and many thanks to the organizers. I see Michael here, and Pacific Neighborhood Consortium. This is an honor and a privilege to speak to you today, and I have slightly broadened my topic. Hopefully, can you hear me okay in the back? You can hear okay? Okay. Good. So let me get into the topic right away. I thought I would start with something that's on many people's minds in this part of the world these days, which is the One Belt and One Road initiative coming out of China. Massive infrastructure projects now running into all sorts of obstructions and obstacles as local governments realize the debt burden that comes with accepting some of these initiatives. And I want to show you an alternative network that's developed perhaps in response, certainly in terms of the Kou-Hao, the slogan of this group, which is not Yi Dai Yi Lu, but Yi Hai, Yi Miao, one sea, one temple. Now, the big question for many has been whether Chinese involved in the Yi Dai Yi Lu government initiatives can enter into the temple and association networks that have long preceded that initiative and which have a several hundred-year-old history in Southeast Asia. Or on the other hand, can we see different formations arising out of the local initiatives? And I think this is one such example. It began in this small, well, now it's about 300,000 city of Sibu. This is the temple in question. You'll notice there are quite a few churches nearby. This is a largely Methodist area, but we'll get to that. In the old days, it was a very small settlement along the Rajan River in Sarawak. And remained that way until the 20s and 30s, very much local handicraft industry, later into rubber and other sorts of products, natural products. But about 10 years ago, the temple decided that it would begin a network of Tudigong temples which are called Dabo Gong temples in Southeast Asia, around Sarawak, starting in Sarawak. So they began, here we see the early dates associated with this region. The temple I'm talking about is the Yunganting Dabo Gong, which founded in 1871. We have some inscriptions from 1897 that show that it was a very extensive Zhangzhou, Quanzhou, Fujian network behind it. And those were Chuanhao, boat captains from the whole region, all the way as far to Singapore and back to Fujian, supporting this temple. They brought back a temple from Dabo Gong, and it survived various misfortunes. And starting in 2005, actually, another temple, a Guangzhou Zunwang temple up north in Sarawak, began holding this kind of processions for Dabo Gong, for Tudigong's birthday. And that Yunganting got into it in 2007. By 2009, they were organizing these events. Within a few years, they had gathered a group of over 100 Dabo Gong temples from Sarawak, from all the different parts of Sarawak. And pretty soon they began expanding into other parts of Malaysia, into Kalimantan in southern part of Borneo, and eventually held in 2017, their 120th anniversary, where they published this volume, listing the now close to 200 members of their network, and giving a representation of their temple, as you see, sort of beginning to float off to sea into the ocean. Here, a halo, a rainbow is present, showing that they're getting closer to their goal of freedom from the mainland. They start to float off into the ocean. If you think this is just a fantasy vision, I'll show you this picture of a temple out at sea. This is off the coast of Sarawak, Shentian Shangdi Temple there. So it is possible, in fact, to have a pirate life as a god. But what's really interesting about this group is that they actively create the networks. So this is a map showing all their movements from their place of origin up to the Philippines, then to Taiwan, then over to Xiamen, Macau, Vietnam, over to Myanmar, down to Malaysia and Indonesia, going on a whole kind of networking project, creating an alliance as they go, visiting Dabo Gong temples in every port city of the Southeast Asia, and creating a network. The idea is that it's a horizontal network. Each of those Dabo Gong is responsible for its own people in its own place, and they are horizontally connected rather than vertically top-down, a bottom-up type of network. My point here is that this is just one of thousands of similar networks that have formed over the centuries in this part of the region, of this part of Southeast Asia. If we look at this volume, which is a list of all the 6,000 Chinese associations in Malaysia alone, we get some sense of the scope of the dense networks that cross this region. So we're going to put this on a GIS map, and we'll put it on our website soon so that you can begin to look at kind of the question of the overlooking, intersecting networks in the region. This is a diagram drawn by my teacher, William Skinner, when he was in Thailand, of the interlocking directorates and elected office staffs of Chinese community organizations and business firms in Thailand. But it gives an idea of the kinds of projects that we can certainly do using the data that I've described and linking biographical information to network information. Basically, what we're hoping to do through these projects is develop a shared open platform for the study of Southeast Asian Chinese communities using digital tools of digital humanities. So we've put together a Singapore historical GIS and a Singapore biographical database. These are ongoing projects. We're linking our studies of the epigraphy of Singapore and other materials such as Qing Dynasty tombs, burial records, genealogical information to that database. And in order to expand into Southeast Asia, We'd very much like to follow the lead of Oliver Streiter, who spoke yesterday about Wolfgang Franke's epigraphy project in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, and some of the losses to that material that have occurred in just 20 or 30 years. In any case, there are still many more places to explore, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, Philippines, and we need to link that epigraphical information to the material coming out of Southeast China. I've collected quite a bit of that, and I'll show you some of that in a moment. But in that material, we find a great many references to Southeast Asian patrons coming back to China. Already in the Kangxi period, we have temples sending out people to Batavia to come back and rebuild their temples that had been affected by the coastal evacuation of the Manchu period. We have a great deal more information for more recent times. Since 1980, probably over 1 million temples and ancestral halls have been rebuilt in China with money from Southeast Asia and Taiwan. So this is a huge project of world historical significance. I think we can begin to map that once we get the epigraphy into digital form and start linking people and places around the region. Okay, so these are some of our projects. Currently, we have Singapore Historical GIS and SBDB. We're trying to link the epigraphy to it, as you can see, using sources from temples, clan associations, Chinese schools, Chinese cemeteries, building in multiple historical maps, and then trying to link individuals to those places. Gives you some idea of the number of projects going on. The historical GIS, I'll show you a few images from that in a moment. These are just an example of the density of religious sites in Singapore. Doesn't appear that way on the surface when you first visit, but in fact there's over 800 Chinese temples, 250 Chinese associations, over 500 churches, 100 mosques, and so forth and so on. There used to be 200 villages on the island. They're all gone, as are most of the 180 former cemeteries and the 550 Chinese schools, also gone. So a lot of changes, especially in the recent years, in recent decades. Nonetheless, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because I'm not even including the unofficial religious sites, such as Yue-Gau, which has over 1,000 family altars in Singapore and has divided the country into different regions and has major churches. So these are many, many other religious organizations occur here, including especially private spirit altars in apartment blocks, in the housing development blocks, which are built by the Singaporean government to house now over 80% of the Singaporean population. But individuals can and do have probably over 1,000 spirit altars in those apartments. And from there, there's always pressure to build a new temple, to develop the funding to try to gain the money to set up an independent temple. So some of these lead to very interesting results. Part of the problem is that most religious sites in Singapore only have a 30-year lease from the government, which often means that after 30 years, they have to raise another couple $1 million to buy another parcel of land, another couple $1 million to build another temple. It's good for the construction business. But it also means that a number of them have moved to Geylang, which is a red light area, now packed with temples and associations, because there they can get a 90-year lease. And so that's a good business investment if they can find a spot in that region. But it means that it's now an all-purpose area where you can commit any sin and have it pardoned by a number of religious groups. Okay, so what are the intellectual stakes involved in this type of project? Several years ago, the famous modernist architect Rem Koolhaas wrote a very scathing essay called Songlines, in which he described Singapore as a state-imposed tabula rasa, intent on erasing history, imposing homogeneous, he called it brutalist spaces, domesticating nature, fetishizing colonial heritage, and turning Singapore into a giant shopping mall. Now, this is a very cruel article. It gets my students really upset, but at least it gets them thinking. And I think it's useful for that purpose, but it's also really essential to show them the work of other cultural geographers and theorists of Singapore, including Lily Kong at SMU now and Brenda Yeo at NUS, who've developed a much more complex account, emphasizing the power of the historical imagination to absorb and critique both nostalgia for the kampong, that's the former village life, and state-constructed national heritage. Another interesting theorist in this field is Yue-Gau, also at NUS. He's described the kind of cultural hybridity, alternative modernity, and mixed spaces in which the continuing power of ritual traditions, more powerful, he says, than culture or modernity, create life as it is, not an as-if alternate ritual world. So his work is very thought-provoking too. But in recent years, a lot of emphasis in geography has gone towards mobility studies, mobility and its resistances to mobility. And I think we need to start seeing Singapore as a node in a multiple overlapping entangled networks of mobilities moving at various speeds. Migrants of all kinds, that's labor migrants, intellectual migrants, student migrants, all kinds, but also gods, ritual specialists, opera troupes, temple artisans, and ritual artifacts like incense and spirit money and god statues, which flow all through this region. So, Singapore database is something we've tried to develop for, all of these are online, and we encourage you to go online. These are some of their sources for that. About 1,200 biographies from one volume, another few hundred from another. You can see here we're gradually building up large sets of information about individuals in the history of Singapore, and trying to integrate it is one of our most difficult tasks. We also have a lot of burial records that we've included. So we've got the names of 68,000 people buried in Bukit Brown. If you have a chance while you're in Singapore, you might want to visit that cemetery. It's a really beautiful part of the island that's still there, but we don't know for how much longer. So take your chance while you can. We have lots more kinds of information available through the special collections of the Hui Guan Te Kan and Miao Yu Te Kan. These are commemorative volumes of temples and associations in the NUS Chinese Library Rare Books Room. They have several hundred of them. Around Singapore, we've got over 1,200. We think that if we start contacting the 6,000 associations I mentioned before, we can gather an even larger set for Southeast Asia. A lot of these have a great deal of biographical information in them. There's also work to be done on the genealogies here, and to try to link individuals through genealogies back to China or within Singapore. That's something we're actively working on. Okay, these are all ongoing projects, just to give you an idea of the kinds of materials. You can download what we have on our data set already, so please do, and please play with the data and see what you can come up with. We'll be very interested in any discoveries you may make from our materials. These are the epigraphy volumes that we did recently that include about 1,200 or so inscriptions of various kinds. And these are the former graveyards that used to be around Singapore. We got these by going through all the historical maps and finding where they first occur and then when they last occur on various different layers of historical maps. Now, from that we can find that this one in particular, Hengshanting, which was the Fujian, the Minnan people's main cemetery, was eventually taken over by the expansion of the Singapore General Hospital. There are a few sites of graves still tucked away around the different grounds of the hospital, but most of the graves were moved, as you can see, in various different stages out into the Bukit Brown area. And Bukit Brown is just the area in red. There are several other cemeteries around it, traditionally older ones. So these are some clusters of tombs in the cemetery, Qing Dynasty tombs. In some cases, they were moved in groups, as you can see here, so we see a whole set of them. This is all land that we had to have cleared because a lot of it's overgrown now. The cemetery was closed in 1972. It was only open from 22 to 72 for about 50 years during that time. So we go in and we find the tombstones, and then we collect the inscriptions. This is, we think, the earliest tombstone in Singapore, 1826. We also found the earliest Buddhist record of a Buddhist monk in Singapore. His tombstone, oh sorry, that's gotten skewed, in 1847. Now, he was an elderly monk, and so we were wondering if he might be this man. There's no way to know. This is an early photograph of a monk with a young Buddhist novice. Now, there's a Buddhist novice's tombstone too, so maybe these two knew each other. It's difficult to know for sure, but we're gradually assembling the history of of the Buddhists, early Buddhists of Singapore. Now, there is another tombstone of another Buddhist who was a little bit more interesting. He had not only several generations of disciples, he also had his own children and grandchildren. So he must have been a very interesting monk. So we continue to look for more information of this kind. But basically, we've come up with about 1,300 of these Qing Dynasty tombstones in Singapore so far. Okay. One interesting thing we can do with those tombstones is trace them back to their Laiyuandi, to the Zuji, to where they came from in Fujian. And so we found about 150 sites in Fujian linked to these inscriptions so far. That's out of only about 500 of them. One of these places, Xiecang, outside of Haicheng in Zhangzhou, in the Zhangzhou Jiulongjiang River mouth, sent 40 people out. So I went to Xiecang and found their Jia Miao, their ancestral hall, and there I found inscriptions from 1801 from Cai Shizhang, excuse me, this is a Cai lineage, very large Cai lineage, about 15,000 people living in nearby villages in around Xiecang. But they have 9 branches and they have people all over Southeast Asia. The ones in Malacca, Cai Shizhang was the captain, Jabidan of Malacca, leader of the Chinese community there. He went back and rebuilt the Jia Miao, the family temple, put up his grandfather's Shenju Pai there, and set up an ancestral trust to make sure that the offerings would be given to his grandfather's tablet. Now his grandson came in about 30, 40 years later and brought Cai Shizhang's spirit tablet to the same place and also set up funds to ensure the continuity of worship for him. So I asked about the ones in Singapore. They said, we don't know those people. You know, those are not famous descendants of our lineage. And indeed, they were buried in very small graves with very minor tombstones. But we found some very elaborate tombstones from the same village in other parts of Bukit Brown. So we think that we can gradually unravel a history of different kinds of migration, of different success stories and different failures in the history of the migration using these kinds of sources. Now, taking a broader picture of Southeast Asia as a whole, we can use Wolfgang Franke's dated inscriptions to show the spread. This is the 17th century. This is the 18th century, where you notice a lot of development along the northern coast of Java and beginnings in Malaysia here. By the 19th century, we have a vastly expanded set of points because we have a lot of different dialect groups getting involved. It's not just the Hokkien Minnan people, but it's now also Cantonese, Diuzhou, Hakkas going into the mountains and up the rivers and so forth and so on. So, so up to 1990, you get even more sites up in northern Thailand. Obviously missing here is Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, Philippines. So we have a lot of work to do. And I hope everybody will join us in that project. These are some of Franke's studies, and this is the overall distribution. He has roughly 5,000 inscriptions from these different locations, as you can see in this chart. Okay, now, in his chart, we can also find which cities has the most number of temples, cemeteries, associations, ancestral halls, and so forth. And in this case, you see Penang is at the top of the list. If we go to Penang, these points in orange are his points that he studied. But these points in red are ones that we added from scraping the web for information about Chinese temples there. And these blue ones are associations. And we think we can add a lot more once we add in more association addresses and data. These are just Fujian associations. But the point is that Franke probably covered about 1/10 of the temples in Malaysia. Now his goal was to find dated inscriptions. So I understand his principle of selection, but there are different kinds of projects that we can begin, including tracing his materials and doing a better modern version of it, but also expanding our scope to look at wider phenomenon, such as more recent temples, or temples that never had any historical data, but nonetheless, from a geographical distribution point of view, can tell us a lot about the history of the evolution of the city and the community. So These are some inscription volumes that we've recently done for Jiangzhou. There's lots of Southeast Asian information in here in terms of patronage. It's very interesting, going back to the Ming already. And these are the ones for Quanzhou that we did some years back, and we did one for Putian as well. So the total is about 5,000 inscriptions from that region. The ideal would be to digitize those as well, and then link them in a database and cross-reference those in Southeast Asia. And already we found a number of Singaporeans who've gone back to different places in Fujian. For example, Zhang Fangnin has inscriptions on he was the leader of the opium cartel here and the temple leader at the end of the 19th century, built or rebuilt 7 or 8 temples here, was called the Jieh, the libationer of the Fujian community. But he also went back and contributed to Baoshan Dadi's great temples outside of Xiamen in Haicang. Lim Bong-keng, who built the first Buddhist monastery here, which if you have a chance to go visit is absolutely beautiful. You should definitely see it. Lianshan Shonglin Si. In any case, he also contributed to the famous Tang temple in Jiangzhou, Nanshan Si, and brought a white jade Buddha from Burma to it, just as he did to Shonglin Si. He brought 4 to Shonglin Si. In any case, these are networks that go back and forth, and we already have quite a bit of information showing the extent and range of these people's, the leaders' activities across Southeast Asia. So it's just a matter of expanding that beyond that top 1% of leaders to a broader picture, which we can now do using digital humanities tools. So these are movements out of Putian to Southeast Asia, and importantly, they're religious migrations, in my view. They come together around spirit medium altars and temples, or around Christian communities like the Methodists we saw in Cebu, or 3-in-1 groups, Buddhist groups. There's all kinds of groups, and these religious institutions play a key role in the history of the expansion of these Chinese into Southeast Asia. I think it's still true to a certain extent today. Otherwise, why would we still have 800 temples left in Singapore? It's in itself a statement of the survival and sustainability of these temple communities, despite all the massive urban redevelopment here. Okay, now I'm just going to go over this really quickly because I think that we'll have another talk on this by Xu Duoduo and Professor Bond. So I'll just go quickly through this. These are why use TEI to do this. I think you all know the answers, so I'll leave this for their talk pretty much. Because I think they're giving a specialized discussion of these matters on, is it tomorrow or Friday? Tomorrow. So please look for Xu Duoduo and Professor Bond's talk if you want to hear more information on this. I'll just go through this really quickly now because there's some pretty cool slides and some pretty cool correlations across our different databases. From our inscriptional information, we can find many people that occur in these different databases that we've already developed. So we're starting to create networks and to see effects across this. These are some network visualizations of people who contribute to several of the bigger places. This third group in green contributes to at least 3. So we're starting to be able to develop statistics for the analysis of the interactions between the early temples in Singapore. These are other forms just out of Doda's latest paper. Some of the runs in red are can be put to the side, and then you can start to go into this tangled mass and begin to make some sense of different distributions. For example, this is the Cantonese distribution, which is very clumped together. People are working together in the Cantonese community, whereas in the Hokkien community, there's a great deal more diversity and range of interactions. These are just very general snapshots of social phenomenon, which we can then follow through and examine the reasons for. But it's some of the useful features of these kinds of charts and maps allows us to trace individuals or whole communities in their interactions in Singapore's cultural history. Singapore starts out, as you know, in 1819. Of course, it was much older. There's already a lot of archaeological evidence of a large Malay community here in the 1400s. Nonetheless, with Raffles and the rest of them, we have the formation of the area around the mouth of the Singapore River. And that area was divided up, including divided according to regional language group communities. So the yellow, this green line, by the way, is the ocean. All of this is reclaimed. marina sands and all the rest, which I wish would just go back into the sea. But anyway, not very Singaporean of me. But anyway, this yellow community was the Hokkien community. If you go downtown to Telok Ayer Street, you'll find the old Ten Hokkien Temple and the one of the Haijing Miao of the Chaozhou, which are in red along the river, running all the warehouses and so forth. There's a hill right behind Amoy Street, behind Ten Hokkien, and that hill, Hsiang Hill, divides the Hokkien community from the Cantonese community, which is along Northridge Road. Now, in each of these dialect communities' neighborhoods, they have a whole set of their temples in the Round Points and Huiguan regional associations. The idea is that if you cross the street, you enter into a different linguistic environment, and you probably just want to go home because you don't necessarily speak the language, or some people learned how to speak several. But each of these areas control different sectors of the economy, and it was very, very clear what the boundaries were. And they all had secret societies that protected those boundaries and those market niches. Now, this distribution continued into the 1950s. And only in the last 30 or 40 years has this been totally disassembled. But that gives you some idea of the preservation of these communities for over 100 years in Singapore's history. Now, the other part of the Singapore story was that there were a lot of villages across the whole island. There were these yellow villages, and they all had cemeteries next to them. You buried your ancestors nearby, and you carried out your ancestral worship that way. Now, the background here is starting to be the HDBs. As soon as the HDBs go in, they start in the 60s, but they really pick up speed in the 70s and 80s. This is by the end of the 80s. All of these village points have been eaten up by the HDBs. They've been taken over by HDBs. Now, this is the end of the HDB expansion, but there are very few villages left, or they've become military installations, that kind of thing. So the villages are gone. Now, these are the Chinese schools, which also flourished, as you can see, across Singapore until the end of the 80s, when they also were gone, like this university, as you probably know. It was originally Nanyang Technological University, closed at that time and then resurrected as the technological university we see today. So, big changes. Now, all of those villages probably had 3 or 4 Chinese temples, and all of them wanted to find a place to move to within the HDB land, which controls the auction for religious space. It's an auction, so you have to outbid other religious groups to get access to pieces of land and then build your temple. These are all Chinese temples that, as you can see, are distributed within the HDB territories. These are points that our students went out. We send groups of about 70 teams per year go out together to gather information using an app that the computer science people developed for us, where they can take a series of photos in a certain sequence, ask a set of questions, gather the information, and directly upload it to our servers. So all these points have a associated dossier with their reports and their photo albums. So we have about 30, I think we've got about 250 temples covered so far and associations covered so far. We will continue to expand it until we reach a kind of point of no return. Anyway, this is a kind of classic scene from the 80s in Singapore. You see the village in front being torn down and the HDB behind it being built as the village is going. Most villages were then dispersed to a whole series of HDBs around the island. Very few moved as a whole into an HDB. When they did, in 2 or 3 exceptions, we find they brought their temples with them, their ritual specialists, they preserved a kind of village community even in the HDB. But that's the exception. However, because the transportation system also was so excellent here, well, let's see, that's a temple that's moved 4 times. This is part of our problem for our representation. How do you show hundreds of temples moving over a few decades on a screen that doesn't begin to look like a video game? I'm still trying to figure that one out. Well, a lot of them moved into united temples. Each altar is a temple, formerly an independent temple, one of these temples in this village. They all moved into this building together. It's called a united temple. Some are more united in name than in reality, but anyway, they all tried to do their rituals in front of their altar that way. There are about 65 of these. They have about 350 temples in them in Singapore. Right. Now, sometimes they've had to move several times, sometimes eventually into a united temple, and eventually they might not even have the funding to sustain that. So they have to retire their gods, put their gods into retirement homes back in this case, Jinmen, but it's been happening in Fujian quite a lot too. So the gods are brought back, a certain amount of money is transferred to ensure that there will be sacrifices for those deities back in the old country. So it's old folks' home for deities. But you can see nobody's looking very happy in this picture. So I think this is the worst scenario. Most people will try to find a way to keep the gods in Singapore if possible. Now, the gods of Singapore are often gods that came from Fujian or from Guangdong or other Hakka regions. These are all the main gods of Fujian. They're founding temples, sites, and all of them can be found here in Singapore. And recent years, a lot of those gods have come to visit. So Mazu came in a first-class ticket named Lin Mo, and her two sidekicks also had business-class seats. And they were brought through to 16 temples here in the Mazu network. It was a really interesting event. But smaller scale events of that kind occur frequently in Singapore. So here we are again with Singapore as a religious built environment rather than a modernist city. So this is some data and information on the numbers and kinds of different temples that we've come across here, or of the different associations and churches and so forth. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious community. From these surveys, you can see that the 1980s, 1990s, 2000, the Buddhist community is still over 1 million in Singapore, which has a total population well, you could say the Singaporeans are about 3.5 million, and then there's another 1.5 foreign laborers here. So this is still a significant proportion claiming religious affiliation of one kind or another. And it goes up and down depending on a lot of different things, which we don't have time to talk about. But I thought it was somewhat interesting for you to see. Popular religious community is still the largest. Then we have different kinds of distributions of all kinds of different religious groups, including sectarian groups, including Jieh, female-run temples dedicated to Shen-Tian Dao. We have lots of Taoist associations from the different groups. So Singapore has all these different groups with their own ritual specialists, their own ritual opera teams, all of them still active in Singapore to some degree, although in marked decline from the past. These are the Hokkien Taoists, and they go back to Trenzhou, where the Dongyue Guan was built in the Song Dynasty. They claim to be 17 generations deep. We don't really know, but these manuscripts are certainly late Qing. So I only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to try to race through this second part because I'm thinking that we need to remember what Marcel Mauss taught us about civilization as a technique, as a technology that doesn't belong to an individual country or a nation, but is something that's spread from one place to another through techniques of the body, such as the ones he describes here. I think that there are necessarily biological means of entering into communication with God, was his conclusion. Right. Now, that means we can look at Southeast Asia as a social laboratory, where successful innovations overseas are brought back to replenish the cultural repertoire at home of the home regional culture. And I'll give you some examples very quickly. These are, first example, the religious sphere in Singapore is constantly changing, as is the one in Taiwan. Taiwan's is probably the most active in the world. But I think Singapore is also undergoing interesting changes. One of these is the rise of underworld deities, who are now common in many of the temples. They're not the main god, but they're the god that often gets tranced by the spirit mediums in the temples. And sometimes they even leave the temples and have parties outside of the temples in which they're sung to, and all sorts of spirit mediums gather. As you can see, quite a few of them are here. And then their devotees gather around them and ask them for state lottery ticket numbers, amongst other good things. It's quite a system. Now, a ritual revolution in gender roles. This is a tiny temple in Sumatra, Tibing Tinggi, and the women there decided that they too could become spirit mediums, just like the men have always been in Putian. They would worship this Gu, and here you see they're onto their 6th Sutan, so 6th training session. They've undergone that, and sure enough, after spreading that practice through Southeast Asia, it returned to Putian, and here you see in Putian all these women training to become spirit mediums, or at least Tanban, altar associates of the spirit mediums. So it's an example of a change in ritual practice in Southeast Asia that then gets absorbed back and becomes part of the Putian training of the spirit mediums. Okay, here's another example. This is the Hsiang down in Waterloo Road. If you have a chance to visit the Guanyin Tang there, it's very famous. Everybody wants to burn their incense stick first at New Year's. So they go in there. But soon afterwards, the whole crowd goes down to the Indian temple next door. And they also go in there. and then they go to a church. So they kind of take over the whole space and go beyond the cultural boundaries and create a kind of ritual community effect that takes over the secular space as well as the crossing cultural boundaries. So that's an interesting phenomenon in Singapore. We actually have one temple that has a Ganesh shrine with Brahmin priests in it, along with a Nadugong Karamat for Malay gods, along with the Dabogong. It's mostly a Dabogong temple, but it has all these other deities within it, Loyang Dabogong, if you have a chance to visit. Okay, here's the 9 emperor gods. This probably started in Southeast Asia. We can't find its origins in China. This is in Thailand. This is a big temple, as you can see, with lots of gods and spirit guys getting possessed by various gods, some of whom you will recognize. And then the 9 emperors are supposed to be the 9 emperors of the Beidou, the 9 stars of the Dipper, which normally has 7, but the Taoists see 2 more. They come down to earth. Oops, that's a little painful to observe, but the point is that they all march through the streets. The entire city gets down on its knees. It's very impressive. It's a very powerful ritual, probably started in Pujing. Basically, they invite the gods in from the sea, and then they send them back to the sea at the end of 9 days of rituals and fasting. Now, we have about 16 of those temples here in Singapore. Just a couple of days ago, we had this group at Chua Tzu Gang, where my daughter's now living. The 9 emperors descend into these 9 spirit mediums, who then take over the streets and go out to the seaside and send off the gods. We sent our students to document this, but they were told that they had to carry the goddesses, Beidou, the Domu's palanquin instead. So they got drafted into the procession, which is very good for them. Now, we also have other kinds of processions like this. There's a big Taipusan march of penance and skewering by the Indian community, but in fact, about 1/10 of the participants are Chinese. And it's very interesting. This occurs all through Southeast Asia. These are 2 different spirit medium processional traditions that have mixed and crossed paths in Southeast Asia, the Indian traditions as well as the Chinese ones. So we're just really not sure who's studying from whom, who's picking up what techniques from which group. But this is definitely a place where these things are mixing. My last example will be spirit medium culture in Singkawang, which is on the coast of Borneo over here. That used to be the Lanfang Gongsi behind it in the mountains, where the Hakkas had gold mines and an independent kingdom outside of China, which lasted for about 60 years. Independent from the Dutch, independent from the British, independent from the Dayaks. They controlled it. They had about 20,000, 30,000 miners up there, brought a lot of gold out of there, and Singkawang was the port from which it all left. Nowadays, we're gradually building up a GIS for Singkawang. On Chinese New Year's, at Lantern Festival, there's a procession of over 1,000 spirit medium troops through the streets of the city, and there are about 1,000 altars then that we're now trying to figure out the placement of. They all use the same spirit medium Dao Jiao. It's filled with nails and spikes and various sharp things that they all do the same Olympic routine on top of. We just saw that wonderful gymnast do her routines a few days ago. The spirit mediums have a very set routine that they have to do on these chairs. And they're carried through the streets by a whole entourage, so tens of thousands of people are in this procession. Now, the processions include gods that I'm not too familiar with, but especially I was not expecting to see the presence of Dayak spirit mediums in the procession. But in fact, about a third, about 300 of the group's troops are Dayak. They're still using the spirit medium chairs, but they're in their own costumes, and they bring some of their own deities along, different music, different dancing styles. This is an example of some of the dancing. Okay, maybe too much. Right, let's move on. Okay, use your eyes if you do. He's using the flat side of the sword, by the way. Anyway, you get the idea that it's somewhat different from what we're used to, especially from the recurring spirit mediums. But the point of that demonstration was that they are doing those rituals in front of a series of Chinese gods. At the end of their dance, they will drop Huawei, a divination box to see if the gods approve. And the man in the biggest hornbill headdress then put on a Muslim cap when he finished. So the city is calling itself the most tolerant city in Indonesia. It's a really fascinating place, 70 or 80% Chinese, still to this day. But a case where we have mixes of Chinese civilizational techniques, such as spirit medium civilization, mixing with local traditions. The other curious thing is, of that 300 Dayak dressed people, I would say that 200 were actually Chinese dressed up as Dayaks. So local Chinese wanting to put on Dayak clothes and dance in Dayak style. The reason being that it's very difficult to be trained as a spirit medium. You have to be within the family, within the tradition, within your own temple, whereas the Dayak Datokungs are willing to teach people how to trance nature deities more readily. So more people can quickly get into the parade that way. But it's a fascinating phenomenon in its own right in terms of cultural assimilations. So I conclude now by saying that we have a lot of work to do together, and I've learned in this conference that the Taiwanese have done so much more work than anybody has even known about. I'm so astonished each time I hear new presentations from Taiwan. I was at Academia Sinica recently looking at all their work they've done on temples and distributions and putting GPS units on the sedan chairs of the gods so they can follow the procession routes. Fantastic stuff. And then this work with DocuSky out of Taiwan University, Shanjia's projects, have given us fantastic tools, which I think Dodo has made use of in her presentation, to expand and use work our materials through. But a great deal of work still hasn't been done. A lot of the digitization that's already been done in Taiwan has not been done for Singapore sources. Almost all this Chinese materials had never been gathered till I got here 5 years ago. I find it astonishingly weird. But there's so much more work that people can do together more effectively and rapidly. And we can expand this project to include the different communities in Singapore. We can include the Indian communities, the Malay communities in these projects. We can work with the Christian communities to create a richer overall account of cultural space in Singapore, and we can expand that project into Southeast Asia. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to introduce some of our projects. Please go to our websites. They weren't working a couple of days ago. I got very nervous, but now they're working again. So, so please have a look when you have a chance. Thank you very much.
Now I think I understand a little bit more why you moved to Singapore. Yeah. It's really fascinating. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a Q&A. If we have some time at the end of the session, perhaps you can entertain a few questions. So our next keynote speaker is Professor Chen Yue-Gau. Professor Chen is from is a distinguished research fellow at the Research Center for Environmental Changes at the Academia Sinica, and he's also the executive secretary of the Center for Sustainability Science. I will skip the rest of the introduction to give you more time to speak. So let's welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman, and great talk did by Professor Ding. Wow, our tempo becomes so dynamic. This is the first time I learned. But back to another dynamic nature story. So my talk will focus on the disaster management. And actually, because this conference, the main thing is the digital humanity. So please look into the philosophy. We're working on this disaster philosophy. Actually, the data are the core to help a lot. Well, it's not my own work, so I just do a summary. In the past 10, 15 years, I worked for the Ministry of Science and Technology and the government in Taiwan. So that's why I have a lot of collaboration from universities and overseas scientists. So it's a summary. Hope you enjoy this talk and think about what will be the future. And we are ready to face the increased disaster attacking. Okay. Well, this first slide, I just would like to let you know my talk is still related to digital humanity. Okay, humanity is a multi-facet. The concept is chasing sustainable development for human society is all our hope. However, sometimes the disaster comes, we really suffer. And how can we build up the disaster resilience? It's an urgent task. Well, sometimes you can't wait. We sometimes complain, we don't have enough data to do. But we have to wait until data become completed, then we start the job. If you work on the disaster management, you lose the chance, okay? Or in this work, digital data is the key. Before we have this digital world, it's quite slow and not easy to overcome the disaster loss. But right now, we have many more tools to do the job in the stage of prevention, preparation, rescue, recovery, or even long-term resilience building. Well, so it matters not only the amount of the data or the quality of the data, what data in your hand. You have to use it by the technology we have today and the way do the efficient management. So keep in mind, it's a job of saving lives and property. Well, life is most important part. So how to do the efficient, effective job is the key and the core concept of this job. Well, we do have a lot of statistic numbers. So let's have a review for the past years. So then we know we learned something, and we are expecting what we are expecting after we read out all those figures. You will know. The first one is the number has a number recorded from 1900 to 2018. It's quite obvious after 1980 increased a lot until 2000, roughly saturated the number. Every year you have roughly 300 to 400 disasters happen in the world. That means every single day you have one in the world. Okay, by the numbers of disaster from different type. From the left to right is flood, storm, earthquake, this left two disaster cover almost 70% the numbers, and plus this three, this earthquake, extreme temperature, and landslide, so goes up to 70%. So the 70% disaster happen because this 5 reasons. Okay, well, by the type, by the number of deaths, well, which we concern the most. So the earthquake killed a lot, and then the storm, and then the extreme the temperature, plus this 4 covers 96% people lost. Okay, so so who is the most important enemy, and we invest a different budget into different kinds of hazard. So this one we invest a lot, and because the concern. Okay, this figure shows different disaster type along this axis, and this is the time from 1900 to 2020. So this the general impression: some big balls become smaller and gum to the recent year. That means we really did a good job. I really appreciate the new technology development. Otherwise, we have many more this kind of big balls will continue, like a drought, like an epidemic event happened before, but almost controlled the recent years. Also, this flood will kill a lot of people. Right now, it's become better. Okay. However, there's some type of event like earthquake, extreme weather, roughly the same statistical number. That means we have future work to do. This is a last historical slide. I pick up from UNSDR. This is the years from 1990 to 2012. Red line represents the economic loss. The black bars are the people lost. You see, economic loss increased a lot in recent years after 2006, 2007. But the people loss since increased in recent years. And look into the details. These are wind speed of all those cyclones. And the biggest one is this one, is Hsiang. So which is very unusual because roughly typhoon smaller than the hurricane. Okay, that's the nature in the past. But recent years, you see the Hsiang break the records up to 315 kilometers per hour, and it seems to become a common situation, a disaster. So we are facing something stronger than before. Also, last week, the Hajibis attacked Japan. The wind speed reached out to 225 kilometers per hour. See, this kind of a large typhoon around the Pacific, usually, by the historical record, it happens 50 years once. However, almost every year, we found one of them right now forming around the Pacific. So something happening, and disaster is going up. So we have to do a better job to build up the society resilience. That's the main purpose. It's really tougher than before. Do have chance. Well, in the beginning, I showed the slide that we use the technology and use the different management way, and then we can help to reduce the disaster, the hazards. Let me show you some slides. It's not a complete story. Anyway, let you know what we did in the past 10 years. Well, before that, I would like to show you this slide, two definitions to look into the disaster prevention and the reduction. The first one is the vulnerability. Okay, and the second one is disaster resilience. But I don't need you to read it. But if you have a simple impression, will be the individual, community, and then here individual, community, That means there are many components in one society. They are all responsible. So the job belongs not only to the government, belongs to all of us, including individuals. That's the concept in the beginning. That's why we can try to expand the whole management system into not only government, and government collaborate with all individuals together. Okay, no matter the size, the component size, the smallest one is individual. The biggest one maybe government or international government anyway. So the government has different size, and the community has different size, like building, a company, even family or individuals. How to do the efficient way? Two ways. One is apply novel technology, and another one is to work all together. This figure shows the resilience goes by time. And it's a normal function for society. And then once we meet the disaster, the function goes down to a button and climb up again. So this is the recovery stage. The concept is here, is time. If we can shorten this time from here to here, shorten this time, then it's better for us to recover. Or we just strengthen us to let the bottom depths become shallower. That's another way. Okay, both ways are important, but the concept I want to deliver is the time. So time is the most important concern. That's why the data management way, all those ICT technology are our core technology base. Where to start? From individual, you have only cell phone. Okay, come on, you can't do too much, right? So of course, from government has the most powerful, the biggest resource to use, and can coordinate different ministry, different information, and can build a data bank to do the analysis. Yeah, so let's see what we did for some example. The information collected by the government, including the observation and some scientific study, the simulation. Simulation can help the prediction. Okay, sometimes reliable, sometimes not that reliable, but better and better, I believe. New technology is our best helper, not only observing, transmitting, analyzing, reporting, also displaying. It's our life every day, right? So we count on those. Now, this is an example from typhoon and rainfall information. Well, we can predict once typhoon attack attacking Taiwan, the early day and the late day, what happened, the precipitation. This is the typhoon track prediction. Different model has a different result. Anyway, these two are observations. You can have this every single minute, but because the data volume too big, so you need to cut into 10, 20 minutes one figure. Anyway, it's available real time. If you open the internet, and then you can predict what will happen. The precipitation and where you have the hazard most than other places, and where you have to prepare the evacuation. Also, the CCTV. Everywhere you have CCTV. We have CCTV for the reservoir to watch, not watch the animals, so watch the water rise up. And then we save all those information into one national platform to share with all units of the government, also distribute to the other stakeholders. This is one slide to show different reservoir, the current situation. Still a lot to store the water, so if the rainfall drop in this catchment, should be fine. If the rainfall drop into this catchment, something will happen. So you have to do something. Okay. Well, sometimes you really will get the flooding, and the satellite images are very helpful. You can do the SAR image, or even use the UAV to take photo and analyze. Well, also we have the CCTV in the city. So then you can monitor the flooding goes where you have the hazard. Once an earthquake happened, I guess this is in 3 minutes. I guess it's requested by the government from the Central Weather Bureau has to report this. Where you have earthquake scale 3, 2, 1 is quite easy to see. And scientists already create another tool to analyze all the waveform to show you the earthquake mechanism. And in the field, we deployed 800 seismometer. So we were joking, if you sleep with one seismometer a night, it takes over 2 years. Okay, and then you see it comes out in 5 minutes. You know what happened on land. Also, less than 20 minutes, you will have this one. The simulation, earthquake happened, and the propagation where you got a strong shaking. It's quite well, scientifically interesting, but quite useful once you work on the disaster management. Also, we do have the one volcano located beside the Taipei City, the capital. And so we set up the observatory to monitor the different chemical and or physical parameters. This panel shows the temperatures, and this one shows the ground motion, the ground deformation, and then this one shows the what is this? I don't remember. Oh, micro earthquake. There's 3 panels, and this one is the chemical gases like radon, carbon dioxide, also rainfall and the site temperature. You know, if you want to catch up the precursor of the volcanic eruption, you better have a long-term observation to see the background. What is the background? Then you will know what's the anomaly. But everything you can put on this disaster management information platform established by the government. We don't like all those figures. You show those figures to the Prime Minister, he will kill you, okay? So it's simple to simplify like this kind of a meter. Okay, Prime Minister, you are driving a car, you see what happens as the radon, groundwater temperature, carbon dioxide content, and femoral temperature, and he feel happy, nothing happened. Okay, well, we have all those different disaster. Also, we collect a lot of data, and we save into a big national data bank. Data lying there, so you need to use them and distribute the information to the people. Then people can strengthen their self, and they build up their own resilience. This is the key concept is reporting, how to report your data and analyze the result. Like a warning, how to distribute a warning, okay? As a false warning I hate false warning, okay? So you have to do the correct, accurate way. And life supporting information, where you have the shelter, where you have the gas station, you better show people, okay? Not store in the national data bank. How about the news? Okay, you have to train the reporter, otherwise they just broadcast the fake news. Well, nowadays we don't use newspaper. Okay, it's too late. Okay, so from TV, still radio, those are traditional, and then you can use the internet. Well, even a conventional convenience store, they have an internal network. So one of useful tool. And social network site, Facebook, in Taiwan, Line, okay? Or we can generate other apps for ourselves. This is national warning. It's not warning, it's alerts. Tell you what happened from Taiwan, from Japan, from New Zealand. We do have this kind of we call it a fast report. Okay, tell you, earthquake happened here and there, but you're nothing to do because it's far away. Okay, once you are very close to the epicenter, this is a warning. Sorry, in Chinese. Anyway, happens somewhere northeast area. Your place maybe meet the rocking scale 4. Okay. And that worked quite well recent years. And like I'm living in Taipei, one earthquake happened in Yilan, and the P wave arrived and the warnings sent out. And I feel that usually it's S wave. S wave goes slower than the P wave. So I have roughly 3-4 seconds to respond. 3-4 seconds is not too long, but long enough to get away some hanging lights or dangerous place. So it's quite useful, and switch off the metro system or stop the surgery and that kind of a reaction. Okay. Well, up to now, still the jobs from government. Okay. What we can do, the community, the individuals, we have to open data. Okay, so what do we have? We have to share. So open data, I just put here value added because some classified data is not allowed to release. So the scientists are so smart, they just use those data to create the added value data. Then you can open, okay? Then like collaboration with Google, Google, like, Google have a Google map and has a map. We just deliver the information. They can do a very good job. Like this case, all government organization provide the data. Water Bureau, the Soil Water Conservation Bureau, Water Resource Association, and the Highway Director General, National Center Disaster Reduction. They all have added value data. And for typhoon and other disasters, we all store a lot of observation and simulation data. Just now, I show you some of them. This collaboration started in 2013. One event happened in 2014. Our user reached to 1.3 million. Everyone has a cell phone. Switch on cell phone and open the Google has a map. You will see what was going on there, including the alerts and including the hazards. Okay, then we can do one step furthermore is to really collaborate with civil people, because people can see. People are your, sentinel to watch the hazard happening. You're the commander sitting in the office. You only look at the TV. Okay, so government can collect from the people. Build up the working platform. Actually, this is the priority case. We work on the social networking side, okay? Because it's quite widespread. Almost everyone has an account for Twitter. Everyone has an account for Facebook. But those are classified, right? But for hazard mitigation, hazard prevention, government signed a contract with Facebook and Twitter. Then you can use those for only hazard during the hazard time. Okay. Also, watch the real-time volume. What the word right now show up the most. Okay. And combined with the collaborated web GIS, over here is the Google has a map. So can do the real-time sorting and geographically displaying on the map, and reporting the new hazard to the sharing platform everyone using. So that's the project. Actually, this slide is the same project. I just want to show you this three words here: share, distribute, and the feedback. It's not the one way; it's two way. You share, you distribute, and you feedback, and then share, distribute, and feedback during the disaster happening time. You have very much interaction work to do. Okay. Still, those are kind of not the proactive one. Well, proactive collaboration is using civic collaboration to use volunteer, train people, then they can group together to work with you as a task force. And well, I guess right now everyone has at least one cell phone. Okay, then you're using apps. Okay, so we create apps to let our people report the hazard, report the hazard description, report the time, report the location. Then I guess the Professor Chen sitting there, he's an expert on this. So it's quite fast. You got the information back right away in one app, and you just take a nod, then 100, 200 information come back. Those are very useful, and then you still can put all those on this disaster management information platform. which is shared for all government units, and some of the information automatically flow into the collaborators data bank. Okay. Oh, this is the last slide. I guess our disaster management becomes a new mission which involve the efforts from our stakeholder, not only government do hard, no one knows, okay? And the second, the input and output become two ways. Okay, so not only government watch and analyze, we also need the help from the people. Facing to new challenge, well, global warming, everyone knows. So disaster will become stronger. And I guess new technology, especially the communication, computation are necessary. Also, the mindset, how to manage this kind of big data as fast as you can. That's the best way to build up our resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chen. You mentioned at the end that everybody knows a global warning. I think it's everybody except Trump. So somebody should show your slides to him. We have a few minutes left for questions. So do we have anybody in the audience with questions either for Professor Dean or for Professor Chen? Yes, please. Jeanette?
Yes, we considered this already. Once we got a blackout, we don't have cell phone signal. The only way we can use is radio. So the government is ready to deploy the radio station to the blackout area. So the best advice people has to prepare radio receiver anyway. For the emerging time. And once you have the electricity back, and then we can resume all the work, like just I said. So with a different level, we have a different arrangement. If you really have the blackout, it's only one way. But the one way enough. Also, the cell phone can last, sometimes last hours if you don't have the recharger, right? So in that case, we still can send some emerging message by the cell phone to let you know where you have to go, okay?
But the provider service is down.
All right. The service can resume quite soon. You know, the system can be recovered. It depends on the situation. Yep, depends.
Yes, please.
I have a question for Professor Dean. Because I saw your presentation is very interesting, but my question is, what is the trend of indigenous religion? Do you think that female arise a lot in that way?
Yes, I think there's a clear trend to greater participation by females in many of the religious organizations. Perhaps it's more a matter of recognition rather than a real difference from the past. But there's enough of a awareness of the increasing roles of women across many religious phenomenon, especially in Southeast Asia, but perhaps elsewhere as well, that marks an important shift especially in the public roles and public face of women in these organizations. And I think of groups like Jieh in Taiwan as an example of such a trend. But it can be observed in many different layers and phenomenon, which isn't to say that there aren't still very many hierarchical and patriarchal dimensions to many of the traditions we've been discussing in this region. But thank you for that comment. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one for Ken. You mentioned near the end of your talk the sort of emergence of rituals among religions. Okay, now I think one of the characteristics of those religions is that they're all multi-theist religions, not monotheist, which is if you have a unique God, it's more difficult to blend with others, right? But do you see these multi-theist religious rituals borrowing from the Muslims or Christians? Do you see that?
It's a very interesting question. I think there is something very fundamental about polytheistic traditions and their openness to cultural interaction and hybridity is kind of built in to a greater degree. There's, however, in the phenomenon of evangelical Christianity spreading rapidly in China and in Singapore, there's sometimes cases of taking on of local traditions like spirit mediums songs or burning incense as part of the ritual. So we do find some very curious and interesting instances, especially amongst the evangelical community, which is more experimental. And in fact, they take great use of the IT technologies and are kind of evolving into life coaching rather than simply proselytizing in the standard ways. So it's a full-scale use of all these things. Many of them are so large now that they can't fit into a church, so they have to rent auditoriums like this or ballrooms in the hotels and hold their ceremonies there. But I think that's one group that's quite open to using different technologies and including civilizational technologies in the sense that I was trying to discuss them.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions for speakers?
I have a question for Professor Chen. I know I'm not an environmental protection expert. I know people in the environmental protection field use the term resilience. And resilience, according to Oxford English Dictionary, is the meaning is to bounce back or to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. I would like to make an analogy between this term and the medical health system. If we emphasize that a hospital is good at rehabilitation, that would be weird. We will say that cure and prevention is more important. So I do not know why the term resilience is so prevalent. Perhaps we should think about prevention first, to prevent the earth from overheating, prevent earthquakes, instead of emphasizing on resilience, bouncing back, rehabilitating from harm. So I would like to know how would people in the field of environmental protection justify the prevalent use of the term resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm not an inventor anyway, but I heard some our argument before. Resilience, we like to use this term for long-term building up. So resilience, including the prevention, recovery, and rescue, all those disaster management components. So, sum up all those together to use the resilience. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, for questions for our speakers? No? Then I would like to thank you again.
Thank you.
So that concludes our session, and thank you very much for attending.